Welcome back to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we're delving deeper into the profound insights of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support means the world to us. We kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook, thus expanding its reach and allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, cultivating a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. Let's now begin today's reading. Anybody home? September 19, 2019. I have a student, we'll call him George, who broke up with his partner of many years, we'll call her Martha. He went to a Dhamma teacher for some advice on how to handle his grief. And the advice she gave was that you have to remember that George and Martha are only conventional truths. On the level of ultimate truth, there is no George, there is no Martha. Never was. He realized it was bad advice. To say that there's nobody there means that there's nobody responsible, and that the people who are affected by your actions don't really exist, so it doesn't matter what you do. That kind of thinking is the refuge of people who don't like responsibility, who don't like to think there are consequences to their actions. The question he had for me, though, was, why would the Buddha teach such a thing that on an ultimate level there are no beings? And my response was the Buddha never taught anything like that. To begin with, he never said that some of his teachings were ultimate truths and others were only conventional truths. The terms the commentaries use for ultimate and conventional truths Paramatha Saka or Samyuti Saka don't exist in the suttas. And he never said that there are no beings. Again, the terms for no being Nisato or Najivo also don't exist in the suttas. When asked what a being was, he said very clearly and straightforwardly, beings are their attachments. He wouldn't define what you are, but he said that you're defining yourself by your attachments. You create an identity and you go into it. This is the process of becoming, which, as he said, happens an awful lot. It's why we suffer. You create an identity in a particular world of experience. That's becoming. Then you go into it. That's birth. The process can go on indefinitely because we get so fascinated with the becomings we create. The Buddha's images of little children building what he called mud houses. He's referring to the kids playing by a mud puddle, taking the mud and making little houses with it. As long as they're fascinated with the mud houses, he says, they keep playing with them, keep making them. In the same way, we're attached to the things we create. One Western example would be the story of Pygmalion, who created a sculpture of a beautiful woman, and then fell in love with the sculpture, forgetting that he'd created it to begin with. But this process is very uncertain and very unstable because it's directed by our desires. And our desires can go in any direction. As the Buddha said, the mind is so quick to change directions that there's no image, no simile adequate for how quickly it can change. And it's capable of all kinds of things. So there are beings, but beings are very unstable, very changeable. In fact, this is the way the Buddha has you deal with grief of separation, either the death of a loved one or the death of love. Realize how changeable you are, how changeable the other person is, and how universal this pattern is. This applies to everything, everybody. That thought enables your grief to be transformed into compassion. When you think about everybody suffering, why pile more suffering on other people who are already suffering? Why pile extra suffering on yourself, since relationships are marked by so much suffering? That's the first stage in dealing with grief. Ultimately, the Buddha says, you want to go from what he calls householder grief, the grief of not getting what you want, to renunciate grief. The grief that there is such a thing as nibbana and you're not there yet. That he calls a pain not of the flesh, and it's a pain we should actively cultivate as a way to motivate ourselves in the practice. But we have to go through the step of compassion first, thinking of all beings and how much they're suffering. How many people are suffering separation right now? That thought gives rise to a sense of samvega, realizing that as long as you stay fascinated with your mud houses, then no matter where you build them, there's going to be suffering. They're going to be washed away. That's what makes you want to get out. And this is where the Buddha's teachings on not self come in. He says you have to learn how to overcome your fascination with those mud houses. You see that they're made of nothing but the mud of the aggregates. Form, feelings, perceptions, mental fabrications, acts of consciousness coming and going, coming and going. They've been coming and going in all kinds of zigzags. You want to learn how to see that they're really not worth getting involved with. He represents this by the little children suddenly getting sick and tired of their mud houses, realizing they're nothing but mud, and then destroying them. So we're trying to take apart the identity we've created as beings to see that there's nothing worthwhile there. Another image used in the canon is of a chariot. You take the chariot apart and then, when everything's been taken apart, there's no more chariot. Now, this image is sometimes interpreted to mean that there never was a chariot to begin with. But that's obviously not true. There were chariots. And as long as you're fascinated with chariots, you keep putting them together and fixing them when they fall apart. But when you begin to realize that they're going to keep falling apart, and that even though they have their uses, they're not worth the effort that goes into maintaining them, that's when you dismantle them and say, there's nothing left anymore. But you're not destroying the being you've created. You're just letting it run out on its own while you don't create anything new in its place. What you destroy is your fascination with the process of creating new states of becoming to replace the old ones deteriorating all the time. Think of the image of sand castles at the edge of the ocean. We keep building sand castles, and the waves come in to wash them away. We build another one and they wash it away. And yet we keep at it. We seem to never get enough. The Buddha, on the night of his awakening, looked around and saw beings suffering from just this problem. He realized he himself had been suffering for long periods of time, building these houses. That's why, after his awakening, he said he'd been searching for the house builder, and now that the house builder was seen, he wouldn't build a house again. That was because the mind had been engaged in dismantling. That's the meaning of the word visankhara. It's the opposite of sankhara. With sankhara you put things together, with visankhara you take them apart. He realized it was not worth doing anymore. This is why we say that insight is a value judgment as to what's worth doing, what's not. These identities that we take on are ultimately not worth the effort, even when we've trained the identity well. Now, along the path we do use a sense of self. The sense of self that can meditate, the sense of self that can practice generosity, practice virtue. That kind of self we need as long as the path hasn't yet been fully developed. We need a sense of confidence that we can do it and a sense of competence that we can do it, along with the sense of responsibility that if we don't do it, it's not going to get done. We've got to roll up our sleeves and do it ourselves, with the conviction that we're going to benefit from this. Now, you notice that the Buddha never says what's left after the job is done. If he had said that there were no beings to begin with, you'd wonder, then why does he keep saying that the arahant, after death, cannot be described as existing or not existing or both or neither? If the being hadn't existed to begin with, then nibbana wouldn't make any difference. There'd be no existence. The arahant after death wouldn't exist. But the Buddha was very careful to say, no. You can't describe the arahant in those terms. The arahant is beyond description because beings are defined by their desires, but here there's no desire. So you're undefined. This relates to the Buddha's statement that when you take on an identity, you take on an obsession or an attachment to the aggregates, and you're limiting yourself. The images for the people who are not doing that are images of no limitations at all. As vast and unfathomable as the ocean, or like a fire that's gone out. In those days, when a fire went out, it was assumed to be vast. It was an element. So, what you are the you who's creating these identities, the Buddha never says. That's one of those questions he has you put aside. But he does have you know that the state that comes when you stop being fascinated with this house building these sand castles, building these mud houses is a state of ultimate happiness. In fact, when the Buddha does use the word paramatha, ultimate goal, it's to describe nibbana. It's not used to describe a vocabulary or a language of a certain level of truths that are more ultimate than other truths on a conventional level. After all, he says the arahant knows the limitations of languages, all of which are conventions. Even the Buddha's language of the aggregates is a series of conventions. You use these conventions to attain a direct experience of what's ultimate. So, we're not being asked to content ourselves with arriving at or consenting to an ultimate description of things. We're trying to find, and the Buddha promises, that if we follow the path, there's going to be an ultimate happiness that's not dependent on any conditions at all. And that's his ultimate cure for grief. After all, renunciate grief is not meant to just sit there. It's meant to motivate you. You realize that you're suffering and there's more to be done, so you focus on doing it. It's in the doing that renunciate grief turns into renunciate joy, renunciate equanimity, something that can't be contained in any little house. The Buddha said that, while he was alive, he dwelled with unrestricted awareness, an awareness that wasn't associated with the 6 sense spheres at all. So when the 6 sense spheres passed away, that awareness remained unaffected if we were to talk in terms of space and time. But it's beyond even space and time, which is why it can't be described as remaining or not. It's untouched by the presence or absence of the 6 senses. Yet it can be found. And as the Buddha said, it's well worth experiencing. The meaning of insight. September 1, 2019. As you sit here, you'll be making choices for the entire hour. The primary choice will be whether to stay with the breath. You made up your mind at the beginning of the session that that's what you're going to do. See what happens when you stick with that decision. Each time the question comes up and there's a little stirring of a thought in the mind, choose to come back to the breath. Let the thought go, unless it's a thought related to the breath and helpful for getting the mind to settle down. The mind is always making choices, both when you're meditating and when you're not. In fact, that's its primary activity. Choosing what to do. As the Buddha says, we fabricate the aggregates for the sake of using them. So that gives us 2 things right there. Goals, what the Buddha calls atha, and means toward the goals. This is the way the mind functions. This is the way it gropes through the world, learning about things, learning what works, what doesn't work, which kinds of goals are possible, which ones are not. It's because of this activity that life has meaning. If we weren't making any choices, if we were machines spinning wheels with no alternative but to keep on spinning, there'd be no meaning to it at all. This is one of the reasons why the word for goal in Pali is also the word for meaning. Atha. We look for meanings, instructions, or advice on what are good goals and on what's worth doing, what's not worth doing, for the sake of those goals. Think of the meaning of words. There are some cases where the meanings get translated into other words, and that satisfies you, but in other cases, you start thinking, what is the meaning of the fact that we have language? It's one of our tools for finding what we want beyond the words. If something gets us to what we want, then it has meaning. That's where the meaning of words goes beyond other words. Life itself, in that case, has meaning. You could say that we live by meanings. I've been reading an account of Nud Rasmussen going by dog sled across northern North America. He was interviewing shamans, storytellers, and poets among the Inuit, and he was always interested in how they interpreted the meanings of their stories. There was one storyteller who told him a story about a fox and a wolf. The fox tells the wolf that he's learned how to use his tail to catch fish. The wolf wants to know how to do that. He'd like to have some extra fish in his diet. So the fox says, well, you dig a hole in the ice, then you stick your tail down into the hole, and if you feel anything nibbling at the end of the tail, you pull it out, and there you've got your fish. So the wolf does as he's told, and the fox gets out of there as fast as he can, because he knows what's going to happen. The wolf's tail gets frozen into the ice. So what does he do? He has to bite off his tail. Of course, he's furious at the fox and he goes looking for him. The fox sees him coming, so he takes some leaves and he holds them in front of his eyes so that the wolf can't recognize him. The wolf comes up to him and says, "Have you seen that other fox?" And the fox says, "I'm sorry, I haven't seen anything. I'm snow-blind right now, which is why I have to hold these leaves in front of my eyes." The wolf believes him and goes away. End of story. Rasmussen asked the storyteller, "What is the meaning of that story?" And the storyteller said, "Why do you have to have a meaning? This is the problem with you white people. You have to have meanings for things." Well, in one way the storyteller was right, and in another way he was wrong. If the story were totally meaningless, if it weren't amusing, if it weren't entertaining, there would be no purpose in telling it. It does have a purpose, which is entertainment. But it doesn't have a moral, aside from teaching you to be really careful around foxes. For the most part, though, our best stories do have meanings in the sense of telling us about how to conduct our lives. Those are the satisfying stories, the stories that give us some sense of direction, some advice on what's a good attitude to take toward life. So it's only natural that we look for the meanings of things, which we can then translate into how we make choices in our lives. This is why the Dhamma has an artha, a meaning, a purpose. It's designed to satisfy that desire. It gives us a worthwhile goal. And it teaches us the means to the goal, what's worth doing that will take us to the goal. That's what insight is all about. Teaching us what's worth doing for the sake of a really high-level goal, putting an end to suffering. Sometimes you hear insight defined as just seeing the nature of things. Well, what good is that, unless there's something about the nature of things that you can put into action to serve your purposes? That's why the Buddha's basic teachings for insight are the Four Noble Truths. First, he teaches the problem, suffering. Then he teaches the cause of the problem, and then the means for solving the problem, in other words, the Noble Eightfold Path. The result is that you arrive at the cessation of the problem, the cessation of suffering, the Third Noble Truth. That's the goal. When you see the goal, then you know that you really have gained insight, and you've used your insight properly. This is why stream entry is defined as attaining the Noble Eightfold Path, and why the crucial factor of the Noble Eightfold Path is right view, the Four Noble Truths. A person who's attained a stream is said to be consummate in view. In other words, you've really seen all four truths. There's another description of stream entry as seeing that whatever is subject to origination is all subject to passing away. It sounds like you're simply seeing the nature of things to come and go. But you have to stop and think. What is the state of mind to which that insight would naturally occur? If it's just a generalization about how life has been so far, everything you've seen so far seems to come and go, it's a pretty sloppy observation. You can't prove that it applies to everything. The only time you can prove it is if you see something that's not subject to origination, and you see that that doesn't pass away. When Sariputta attained his first experience of the Dhamma, he then went to tell Moggallana. This was before they had met the Buddha. Moggallana sees him coming from afar and says, "Your complexion is clear, your faculties are bright. Have you seen the deathless?" And Sariputta says, "Yes. It's from seeing the deathless that you can look back on things that are not deathless, and you realize that the difference is that they are subject to origination and passing away, whereas the deathless is not. It's in seeing this that insight becomes complete. And this is what insight is good for. This is what it means. Sometimes you hear that insight is seeing things in terms of the three characteristics. But then the three characteristics, or, more properly, the three perceptions, what are they good for? If you simply say, well, everything is impermanent, what does that tell you about what to do? You could take that observation and do all kinds of things with it. You could decide that nothing is worth striving for at all, so you might as well give up. In other words, that insight on its own can be used for very defeatist purposes. Or you could use it for hedonistic purposes, to justify going for whatever pleasure is within your reach while it lasts. Actually, you use these perceptions properly when you put them in the context of the Four Noble Truths, or more specifically in the context of the analysis the Buddha recommends for gaining escape from the forms of suffering included in the First Noble Truth. You see their origination, you see their passing away, you see their allure, and then you see their drawbacks. It's in the context of trying to see their drawbacks that you apply those 3 perceptions. You look to see the extent to which the things you cling to are inconstant, stressful, and not self, so that you can develop dispassion for them. That dispassion is going to be your escape to the deathless. Those observations have meaning only in the larger context of the meaning of the Dhamma, the goal of the Dhamma, its atha. This is why, when the Buddha described his awakening, he never mentioned the 3 characteristics, or even the 3 perceptions. They're there implicitly in terms of the duties of the 4 Noble Truths, under the insight into the drawbacks of the things to which you cling, the insight that's for the sake of developing dispassion. But the Buddha never explicitly mentions them. He's explicit about the 4 Noble Truths, though. He says that when you see those truths and see them clearly in the same way that a person standing on the bank of a pool of limpid water would look into the pool and see the fish moving around and resting in the water. When you see all 4 Noble Truths clearly in that way, that's when insight is shown what it's good for. That's what its atha is, its purpose is. So we're here not to learn so much about the nature of things outside. We're here more to learn about the actions of the mind as it's making choices, and which choices are worth making to get to a goal that doesn't serve as a means to anything else. That's when we find something that really satisfies the heart and mind, something with intrinsic meaning. This meaning doesn't point to something else or serve a purpose for the sake of something else. It's the one thing for whose sake we do everything else. We all want true happiness. That's what we're groping around in the world for, as we make our choices and then learn from them or sometimes don't learn from them. The Buddha simply gives instructions on how to go about learning in the most effective way. So use appropriate attention. Ask the right questions. Look at your actions. Train the mind so that it can see its actions and their results really clearly. That's why we're here right now. The breath is here to train the mind. We train the mind for the sake of true happiness. These are all means to a goal, although you don't get to the goal by focusing on the goal or trying to clone the goal. You get there by paying attention to the means and doing them really carefully. Still, it's good to have in the back of the mind the realization that the practice does serve a purpose, and to have a general idea of what that purpose is. Because that's what gives meaning to the practice and keeps us on course. Insight is a judgment call. February 21, 2017. As you focus on your breath, try to figure out the best way to focus on the breath. This is a quality called evaluation. It's pretty simple. You're with the breath, but there are lots of ways of breathing and lots of ways of being with the breath. Where you're going to focus in the body, how long the breathing's going to be, how short, heavy, light, shallow, deep, what image of the breath you're going to hold in mind. There are lots of options. Which means there's lots of room to play. But the play here has a serious purpose. We're trying to get the mind as firmly established as possible with a sense of well-being, a sense of balance. So experiment. If you're not sure if one breathing method feels better than another, stick with it for a while and see what it does to the body, see what it does to the mind. Then change and try another way for a while. You could spend the whole hour doing this. As you do this, you're getting more sensitive to what you're doing, and to the results of what you're doing, right here, right now, and also more sensitive to what it feels like to have a sense of well-being in the body. In the beginning, it's going to be pretty ordinary, sitting here without any pains. Or if there are pains in the body, focus on the parts that are not, but they're going to seem pretty ordinary. Yet if you give them some space, give them some time, you begin to see that the breath energy going through the body can have an impact. Either tensing things up or helping things to relax, giving energy or taking energy away. And that sensitivity is what you want to get more and more attuned to, because you're going to use it to make judgments in other areas of your life as well. That's what the practice is all about. Making judgments. We hear so much about how meditation is about learning how to be non-judging, but I can't find that idea anywhere in the Buddha's teachings. He meant evaluation to be a kind of judgment, and you want to develop that quality of the mind, so that you can use it skillfully, so that you can be judicious in your judgments, rather than judgmental, and also sensitive to what you're doing. Because it's what we're doing that ties us down. The Buddha's image is of a fire. The fire clings to its fuel and, as long as it's burning, it's trapped by its fuel. When it goes out, that's when it's released from the fuel. It goes out, not because the fuel lets go of the fire, but because the fire lets go of the fuel. That's how they understood the process of fire in his time, and that's the analogy the Buddha applied to the mind. We're holding on to things that are making us suffer. How do we get released from them? We don't wait for them to let us go. We learn to let them go. And we do that by passing judgment on what we're doing as to whether it's worth doing or not. The Buddha illustrates this with the analogy of a bronze cup filled with a beverage that looks very enticing. In one case, the beverage is healthy for you, in the other case, the beverage can kill you, or at least cause you a lot of pain. Thirsty people come along, and the vendors of the beverage say to each of the people, "Okay, here's this beverage which is good for you, and here's this beverage which is poisonous." Sometimes they don't give you the choice, it's just the poisonous beverage. And they say, "You're thirsty? Well, here's this poisonous beverage. It looks very enticing and it's in a nice bronze cup. It's going to taste very nice as you drink it, but it's going to make you sick, bringing about death or death-like pain." As the Buddha said, it's the wise person who will say, "No, there are other things I could drink. I'll put up with my thirst for the time being." The unwise person will take the beverage. He doesn't care about the consequences because he's so thirsty. That's the problem with most of us. We're so thirsty for things that we grab onto anything without thinking of the long-term payback. We do all kinds of things because we think it's worth it. Or, if we think of the payback down the line, we say, "I'll deal with that later, but I want something that I like right now." The ability to say no to things like that is a measure of your wisdom, a measure of your discernment, and it comes down to seeing what's worth doing, what's not. Like the fact that you're meditating right here, right now. You probably didn't think about meditating as soon as you came out of your mother's womb. It's taken time and a lot of experience for you to realize that this is something you'd actually want to do. To sit here in one position for an hour with your eyes closed, focusing on your breath. I've encountered a lot of people who, even though they've been through a lot of suffering in life, would never want to do this. A woman once came here at the invitation of a friend, and the two of them joined in a group sit for an hour out under the trees at the outdoor classroom. It was a lovely day. The temperature was just right, not too hot, not too cold, with a little bit of a breeze. But after she came out of the meditation, the woman said, "I've never suffered so much in my life." In another case, I was invited back to teach meditation at my old college. One of the students, after 15 minutes, came out of meditation and complained that he had been going through severe sensory deprivation. He was totally disoriented. So, a lot of people don't see what we're doing right now as worth it. In fact, they see it as something they'd want to run away from. But we've begun to see that the question of whether we're going to be happy in life or suffering in life is going to depend on the quality of our mind. How do you develop the quality of your mind? Through strengthening mindfulness and alertness. You strengthen those qualities by sitting here, trying to stay with the breath. You develop a lot of good qualities this way. This is how your discernment develops. Things that you used to see as worth doing, the games you used to play as a child, the things you did when you were a teenager. As you grow up and get more mature, you realize they're not worth it. Whereas things that as a child, as a teenager, might never have appealed to you, suddenly make a lot of sense because you've been observant. Well, that's the principle that carries you all the way through the practice. You learn to be more and more discerning about what you're doing, the results, and what's worth doing, what's not worth doing. When the Buddha talks about insight, vipassana, he doesn't teach a technique. He calls vipassana a quality of the mind, a clear-seeing quality of the mind. And what does it see? It sees things as they arise, along with what's making them arise, and then sees them as they pass away. At the same time, while it watches things arise, it begins to see their allure. Why you want to go with them. It sees their drawbacks, and it weighs the drawbacks against the allure. Then, when it sees that the drawbacks outweigh the allure, it can find an escape through dispassion. That's how insight works. It passes judgment judiciously. It's simply a question of how sensitive you are and what options you see. If something is the best possible thing, if you think the poison in the cup is the only thing you can find to drink, you might go for it. But when you realize that there are better options, you'll be less and less likely to go for the things with drawbacks. You want something whose allure doesn't contain any poison. As you're sitting here meditating, working on your evaluation, working on figuring out what the mind wants to go for right now, the Buddha's image for what you're doing is of a cook who's sensitive to what his master likes. The foolish cook just keeps producing food and doesn't really notice what the master eats, what he likes, what he praises. The intelligent cook listens, notices. Sometimes he doesn't even have to listen, he just watches. What does the master reach for? What does he take again and again? Okay, make more of that. The same with your mind. You've got to learn how to observe your mind. What does the mind go for as you try to get it settled down with the breath? What kind of breathing does it like? What kind of breathing does it not like? Where does it like to be focused? Observe these things. Then observe what could be better in terms of getting the mind more solidly settled down. What are the activities you're doing that don't need to be done? Sometimes we find that we're breathing mechanically simply because we feel the need, or that we're obliged to breathe with a certain amount of strength and energy put into the breath. But what if calmer breathing were better? And how do you calm the breathing down without suppressing it? Well, you connect all the breath energies in the body, and when everything's connected, you can be very still with that. The need to breathe grows weaker and weaker, and at the same time the body is filled with good breath energy. You've developed a sense of well-being that's more solid. It requires more care in getting it and maintaining it, but at the same time, a lot less energy has to go into it. The payback is a lot bigger. You keep doing that. Noticing, noticing, noticing. Observing. Experimenting. That's how your sensitivity develops as to what's worth doing and what's not. This is one of the big problems in life. We have a very bad sense of judgment as to what's really worth doing. You drive up the road to Las Vegas, and you see the big signs advertising 93% payback rate. People keep going there week after week, even though the signs are basically telling them, you give us $1, and we'll give you 93 cents back. Somehow the thrill is worth it, thinking that maybe someday they'll give us more than the $1. A few people get more than the $1, but most people don't. That's why it's a 93% payback rate. There are so many things in life where we dress things up to seem a lot more attractive than they really are. We fool ourselves, and part of the mind likes to be fooled. But there should be another part of the mind that says, I've had enough. I want something better. That's the part of the mind you want to listen to. That's the part of the mind that'll get you to release. Because that's what release is. The mind letting go through its discernment of what's not worth doing anymore. You get there by taking that question and consistently pursuing it further and further in. You try to see what's the best thing that the mind can fabricate. There are some very subtle states of concentration, very strong, and as you develop them, you find yourself getting attached to them. But that's okay, because that attachment allows you to let go of attachments, say, to sensuality, to unskillful thoughts, or even to weaker and less subtle states of concentration. You finally get to the point where the level of concentration is the best thing that fabrication can offer. And you begin to see that this, too, has its drawbacks. That's when the mind is really willing to give the unfabricated a try. It sees its potential value for happiness. Up to that point, there's something about lack of fabrication that scares the mind. But there comes a point where the mind is no longer scared, and that's when it can let go. It starts with this ability to evaluate. What are you doing? What are the results? Are they worth it? What might be better? If you keep those questions in mind, they'll take you all the way. Willing to learn. January 24, 2019. The Buddha talks a lot about the process of becoming, which is a combination of two things. 1. A particular world of experience, and 2. Your identity in that world, your sense of who you are, what your capabilities are. And the two are very dependent on each other. You see this particularly when you go into a new place where the language is different, culture is different, and all of a sudden you become very sensitive to the fact that who you are is not as clear as it was back in your old world. Which of your talents from the old world are still useful, and which ones are going to have to be changed if you're going to live happily in this new world. The same process happens when you come to the Dhamma. It's like a different world, a different culture. The Buddha actually calls it the culture of the noble ones. And a lot of its assumptions are very different from the world of secular life out there. Here we have rebirth, we have karma. The training of the mind is the big value. Money is not the big value. The way people interact is a little bit different. And so in the beginning, it's very normal to feel awkward. There are things you're enthusiastic about, but other things you're very unsure about. And you're going to be changing as a person as you come into this world. Sorting through your old habits and talents, trying to figure out which ones are still useful and which ones are not. But one part of yourself that you want to hold on to and you will be fashioning a sense of self as you practice is your willingness to learn. If you're going to take pride and have a sense of confidence in yourself, that's where you want to place it. Some people come into a situation and they like to pretend that they know everything already, that they can bluff their way through anything. But that doesn't help. They don't learn anything. If, however, you're afraid to do anything at all for fear of making a mistake, then you don't learn that way, either. It's to be expected that there are going to be mistakes. It's like learning a new language. You trip over the grammar, you trip over the vocabulary. And oftentimes the most memorable lessons come from making a big mistake that burns itself into your memory for a long time. We've had examples here with the monks trying to learn Thai or French. But you can't let the mistakes get you down. You've got to decide. This is something really valuable here. I want to master these skills. And you can have some confidence that as you master the skills and are paying careful attention, with that desire to learn, you're going to become a different person, a person who feels at home in this new world. What does it mean to be willing to learn? The Buddha lists 3 types of discernment that you're going to need. The discernment that comes from listening, the discernment that comes from thinking, and the discernment that comes from developing. They're usually ranked with the discernment coming from developing as the really important one, but all 3 of them help one another along. It's not the case that you listen and then you think, and then you just work on developing the mind without ever thinking or listening anymore. You still have to listen, and you have to think even as you're developing qualities in the practice. It's through the combination of those 3 things that you learn. Now, a lot of people have problems mixing those together. Some people are really good at just listening and doing as they're told. Other people refuse to do as they are told until they've thought it through and come up with their own ideas. But it's important that you learn how both to listen and to think. Toward the end of his life, Ajahn Mahabua was recorded as saying that Ajahn Lee was Ajahn Mun's favorite student. When you look at Ajahn Lee's life, you can see why. He was the kind of person who would listen and think in addition to meditating. That's how he wrote all those books. And he was constantly interested in new things. Ajahn Fuang once told me that he thought it was a shame that Ajahn Lee hadn't met me. Here I was, someone with a Western education, and Ajahn Lee would have really picked my brain. He was always interested in learning. When he was abbot of the monastery in Chanthaburi, a new magazine, Dhammakaksu, had come out. The monks in Bangkok were in the process of translating the Pali Canon into Thai, and they published a magazine of articles, along with some new sutta translations, as they were being produced. Ajahn Lee was a subscriber. Once a month, the magazine would come, and for the next couple of nights Ajahn Lee would simply read the magazine out loud during the group meditation. So it's not the case that you learn a few basic concepts and then forget about the books and just meditate, or that you just do as you're told. You have to think some things through. Then, as you meditate, you've got to think through the results of what you've done and try to make sense of where you are, what you've learned. This may have been another characteristic that Ajahn Mun liked about Ajahn Lee. On the one hand, Ajahn Mun would give Ajahn Lee a really difficult assignment like sitting up all night many nights in a row, and Ajahn Lee would simply do it. On the other hand, though, he noticed that Ajahn Lee also had a mind that liked to put things together to make sense out of them. As he told Ajahn Lee, he didn't see anybody else who could help put the different principles of the practice into order. That's what we see in Ajahn Lee's books, what they call Akvicha in Thai. The principles of knowledge or the principles of skill. They require that you have that kind of quality. First, you listen. Second, you try to put things together to make sense out of them. And then third, you actually try to take what you've learned, put it into practice, and be very honest with yourself about the results that are actually developing. Then take those results and think about them again. Where are they still good? Where are they lacking? This is how we put all those three aspects of discernment together: listening, thinking, and developing. Ajahn Lee explains how we do this with analogies of developing skills. He says you learn from the teacher, say, how to weave a basket or how to sew a pair of pants, how to make clay tiles. Then you think about it, and then you do it, and then you think about it again. You look at the example from the teacher and you look at your product. Where is yours still lacking? What does it look like you did wrong? Then you work at it again, and keep observing. Eventually, as you keep this up, you can go beyond what you simply learned from the teacher, and you start thinking of new ways of using that skill. When you meditate, you learn the instructions on how to breathe, how to work with the breath. Then you try them out and look at what you've got. If the results aren't good, go back and look at what you're doing again. Think about it. What's still missing? Try to be observant. Look around. Ask questions if you can't figure things out, and don't be afraid to ask questions. One of the things the Buddha prided himself on was that the teaching he gave was a teaching where you could cross-question the teacher, and he encouraged that. He said, this is a community where people are encouraged to cross-question, in other words, to ask people about what they've said, and be willing to engage in a dialogue. The purpose of that, of course, is to get you to ask questions of yourself. After all, that's how the Buddha gained awakening. He looked at what he was doing. He said, the results are not what I want. So what am I doing wrong? He went back and looked at his actions. He had to think his way through. What might be wrong here? What could I change? Then he tried that out. And it was through trial and error that he finally reached trial and success. You look at the many setbacks he had. Most people would have given up. But the pride he took in his willingness to learn was what saw him through. So as you move into the world of the Dhamma, the culture of the noble ones, you're not expected to know everything. In fact, you're expected to learn how to listen. And listen doesn't mean simply listening to the words. You notice actions. You actually try to memorize some things that seem important. After all, when you meditate, you can't have a book put out in front of you. When you listen to Dhamma talks while you meditate, there are a lot of things in a particular Dhamma talk that won't be relevant to your meditation right now, but it's good to have them someplace in the back of your mind, in case they'll be relevant later on. So when something seems important, memorize it. That's how you listen. Then you think about what you've learned and how it fits in with what you've learned before, to see where it seems to fit and where it doesn't seem to fit. That's when you ask questions, either asking someone else or telling yourself, well, I'm going to put it into practice and see if there's a real conflict here, or if things actually fit together. It's in this way that you grow. As you master more and more skills, you become a different person. The skills allow you to function in this new world, the world of the Dhamma. But simply having the skills doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be successful. There are some people who find it very easy to get the mind to settle down, with no big deal. Other people can read books and immediately explain what they've read. That doesn't make that much of an impact, either. It's when you really stop to listen and think and develop, and then think again with as much honesty as you can bring, With all your powers of observation, that's when you grow. That's when the skill makes you a new person. You find that you develop a new identity that really is helpful in the world of the Dhamma. There will come a day when you don't need that identity anymore. But in the meantime, use it and develop it as best you can. What am I becoming? December 31st, 2019. Here we are at the end of the year. As you meditate, you should remember that and forget it. You forget it in the sense that the practice itself is akaliko, timeless. The principles are the same whether it's the beginning of the year, the end of the year, or the middle of the year. You're trying to develop mindfulness, keeping the breath in mind, and alertness, watching the breath. What's it doing right now? And how is your mind relating to the breath? You're also developing ardency. You want to do this well because it's the only path out. So is the breath comfortable? If it's not comfortable, you can change it. Is the mind staying with the breath? If it's not, is it a problem with the breath or with the mind? You've got time to check these things out. Experiment with different kinds of breathing, experiment with different places of focusing your mind. If the mind's hung up on some issue from the day, learn how to think about that issue in a way that helps you put it aside, so that the mind can settle in with the breath and have a sense of well-being, a sense of belonging here. All of these principles are timeless. But at the same time, it's good to think of the passage of time. The Buddha has you reflect every day. Days and nights fly past, fly past. What am I becoming right now? You can think back to where you were this time last year. How are you different now? Hopefully, you've improved in the practice. But take stock. What are you becoming? Because what you're doing, what you're clinging to, determines what you become. We know that clinging is the cause of suffering, but clinging also plays a part in the path, and learning how to figure out which kind of clinging is good for you, and which kind of clinging is not, is a useful exercise in developing discernment on the path. There are 4 kinds of clinging in all. The first one is sensual clinging, and that has no role in the path. That's clinging to your fascination with thinking about sensual pleasures, how this would taste good or how that would look good, this would smell good, you'd like to eat this, you'd like to see that. You can think about these things for long periods of time, and you can cling to the pleasure that that kind of thinking can give, but it doesn't help you on the path. Now, there will be sensual pleasures on the path. You can't totally do without them. But your fascination with planning for them and then reminiscing about how great that pleasure was, how great this pleasure was, that gets in the way of the path because you need to drop sensuality to develop right concentration here. Which is something you can actually cling to in a beneficial way, clinging to habits and practices. You have to make a distinction. Which habits and practices do you cling to that are getting in the way? Which ones do you cling to that are actually helpful? Clinging to the practice of meditation is not a bad thing. There will come a day when you let go of all clinging, but in the meantime, to get there you have to hold on. Think of the image of the raft. You put together a raft out of twigs and leaves. It may not look pretty. In other words, it's something you fabricate, something you put together. We're not sitting here waiting for the Nibbana yacht to come over from the other shore to pick us up and take us back. We have to put together a raft out of what we've got here. We've got the breath, we've got directed thought and evaluation. These are things we're doing all the time. Breathing in, breathing out, thinking about this, evaluating that. So we take these things we're doing all the time, and we point them in the right direction. We've got perceptions and images in the mind, feelings that we develop through the way we breathe. These, too, are things we're doing all the time. But if we get them in line with the practice, they can become part of the path. You hold on to the raft as you make an effort with your hands and feet, as the Buddha said, to swim across. If you let go of the raft, you get swept away. So you want to have a daily practice of training the mind to settle down. View it as something that's as important to you as anything else that you would do on a daily basis, actually, more important. After all, you brush your teeth every day. You eat every day. Why can't you look after your mind every day? Try to hold on to this practice as something of essential worth. It's your good food. When the Buddha talks about clinging, the word he uses can also mean taking sustenance. This is your nourishment for skillful becomings. The more you engage in the practice of the precepts and the practice of meditation, the more you become a meditator, the more you become a practitioner, and that's a good thing to become. The same with clinging to views. Views can cause you suffering or they can be part of the path, as when you hold on to the right views, understanding suffering correctly. What kind of suffering is causing your problems? What kind of pain is causing your problems? What kind of pain is not really the problem? As the Buddha pointed out, there are things in the world you have to accept. The body ages. It gets ill. It dies. These are things we can sometimes push off for a little while, but ultimately they're going to have to happen no matter who you are. As long as you're a being, the Buddha says, you have to experience aging, illness, and death. The question is, do you have to suffer from them? No. That's where you can make a difference. And you have to hold on to that view. Otherwise, you drift back to blaming your suffering on things outside, thinking of yourself as a victim of outside events, and that doesn't help on the path at all. Regardless of whatever bad things there are out in the world, and we don't deny that there are bad things out there, the important issue is to realize that the extent to which you're suffering from them has to do with your own lack of skill in dealing with them. As long as you hold on to that view, it's not laying blame on you, it's actually offering you hope that you can stop suffering. After all, if you had to change the world to be just the way you want it, forcing everybody to fall in line with your ideas, you would never come to the end of things. But realizing that suffering is something you're doing, it's an active verb, it's coming from actions you're doing, but you don't have to do them. That's the view that helps you find a way out, so that's the view you want to cling to. So again, are you clinging to right view? Are you becoming a person of right view? That's one thing you can become as days and nights fly past. You can ask yourself to what extent you move back and forth, sometimes blaming things outside, sometimes admitting that you're the agent that's causing the suffering. To what extent are you heading more and more in the direction of right view? That's something worth taking stock of every day, every month, every year. Then there's clinging to doctrines of the self. On the one hand, this can lead to all kinds of suffering as you identify with something and then feel you've got to protect it. When the Buddha talks about self, he's not referring only to the idea of a permanent self. There's also the idea of the self that could die at the end of the life of the body. It's not the case that you can cling only to the idea of a permanent self, or you can suffer only from the idea of a permanent self. In fact, people who hold to the idea that what they are is something that'll be annihilated at death get very attached. They'll do anything not to die. Even people who have a fluid idea about their gender, about their identity, hold on very tightly to that. There's a lot of suffering there, too. Self is however you define yourself. If you cling to the wrong ways of defining yourself, you're just going to cause more and more suffering. But if you cling to skillful ideas of self, that you're capable, you're responsible, you're the kind of person who can learn, a person who's not stuck in his or her bad habits, who can recognize bad habits for what they are and be willing to make the change. That idea of self is a good one to hold on to because it opens the path instead of closing it. So as days and nights fly past, the question is, what are you holding on to? And how consistently are you holding on to practices, views, ideas of yourself that are helpful on the path? The more consistently you can hold on in these ways, the better, because otherwise you're going to hold on to the old ways that pull you down. In other words, you've got the twigs and the leaves and the branches on this shore, and you just hold on to them right here. You don't make them into a raft. You cling to the trees. Maybe you hug the trees. But as the Buddha said, staying on this shore is a dangerous place. There are vipers coming after you, and thieves waiting to plunder you. In other words, you've got the sufferings that come from the aggregates, you've got the sufferings that come from the 6 sense spheres, you've got the sufferings from your greed, aversion, and delusion. These things are going to harass and plunder you as much as they can as long as you're on this shore. The only safe course of action is to get to the other shore. So what are you becoming? Are you becoming the person who stays here and builds huts out of the twigs and branches, saying, "Let's create an ideal world here on this shore"? Or are you going to build a raft and cling to it while you make the effort to get across? These are choices you make every day, every time you breathe in, every time you breathe out. You make them at the end of the year, you make them at the beginning of the year, you make them in the middle of the year. So try to become timeless in the way you hold on to the path, so that regardless of which day of the year the question is asked, what am I becoming right now? The answer is, I'm becoming a Dhamma practitioner. I'm becoming a person on the path who stays on the path. Ajahn Lee has a nice passage about how most people straddle two different paths. The path to the end of suffering and the path that leads to more suffering. When you straddle two paths like that, it's a very awkward position to be in and a very uncomfortable one. It's better than someone who's totally on the path to more and more suffering, but still you don't get full advantage of the path that could take you away from suffering. So try to be the kind of person who's always on the right path. If you're going to cling to the things that help you get on the path and stay there, so that when the Buddha asks you days and nights are flying past, what are you becoming right now? You can give him an answer you'd be proud to give. In harmony with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. Presently, we've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible through audio format. The responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the broad dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.